This is the Podcast Lab. Subscribe now and never miss an episode.
You ever get that feeling where you hear people talking about something and you're kind of nodding along, but deep down you're not really sure you totally get it?
Oh yeah, all the time.
Yeah, that's me with this whole cultural appropriation thing. It feels like one of those phrases that gets thrown around a lot, and I think we all kind of have a general sense of what it means.
Right.
But I wanted to really dive into it today, go beyond just a surface level definition. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's something that's really important to understand.
Totally. And our source material is this excerpt from a podcast script. It's actually called Cultural Appropriation versus Appreciation, Understanding the Fine Line.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and one thing that really jumped out at me in reading it is how much power dynamics come into play. It's not just about whether or not something is cool or trendy, but who's taking from whom and what the impact of that is.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Because sometimes you see things that you're just like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem right.
Right. So by the end of this deep dive, my hope is that we'll all be able to spot the difference between cultural appropriation and appreciation. And even more importantly, be able to navigate this tricky territory in our own lives.
I like it. It's like giving ourselves a toolkit.
Exactly. So let's start with the basics. How does the script define cultural appropriation?
Well, they basically say it's about taking elements from another culture.
Okay.
Especially a culture that's been marginalized or oppressed.
Right.
And doing it without really understanding it, respecting it, or giving credit.
Okay, so it's not just about borrowing a cool style or something.
No, it goes deeper than that. They even use the word exploitative in the script, which I think is pretty strong.
Yeah, that's a pretty loaded word. So we're not just talking about a harmless borrowing here. We're talking about something that can actually be harmful.
Exactly. And I think that's important to acknowledge.
Yeah.
Right from the start.
Okay, so let's get into some real world examples. Then we can start to see how this plays out, in everyday life. What are some of the examples the script gives?
Well, one of the big ones is fashion.
Oh, yeah. Fashion's a big one.
It's so visual, right? You immediately see it.
And it's everywhere.
Exactly. So the script talks about things like festival goers wearing Native American headdresses as a fashion statement.
Ugh. Yeah, that always rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, and you see it a lot with designers, too, using traditional patterns from, say, Africa or indigenous cultures.
Right.
But they're not collaborating with the communities who created those designs. They're just kind of taking and profiting.
So it's like they're benefiting from someone else's culture while the source of their inspiration remains unheard.
Exactly. And that's where that power dynamic comes in.
Right. It's not an equal exchange.
It's not.
Yeah.
And it can feel very extractive.
And it's not just fashion, right? The script talked about music, too.
Absolutely. Music is another huge one. They use the example of reggae.
Oh, yeah. Reggae's
not just a catchy beat.
Yeah.
Right? It's deeply connected to the history and struggles of the Jamaican people.
Right. So to strip it of that context and just use it as a trendy sound is to kind of diminish its cultural power.
Exactly. It's like you're telling half the story.
And that makes me think about hip-hop, too. It's gone global. But I wonder how often its origins and social commentary get lost in the process.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And it highlights something really important. When a genre like hip-hop, which emerged from Black communities facing systemic oppression, is adopted by artists who don't share that history, it can feel like a form of cultural erasure.
Yeah, like their experience is being ignored or even erased.
Right, and their voices are being silenced.
The script also talks about food, which is something I think we can all relate to.
Oh, absolutely. Food's huge.
Yeah, like how tacos and pho have become super popular, but often they're served without any real understanding of their cultural significance.
Right, and I think food is such a powerful example. Because it's so tied to family tradition, to history.
Yeah, it's more than just what's on your plate.
Exactly. When a dish is taken out of its context and commercialized, it's almost like its story's being rewritten.
And usually that rewriting benefits the dominant culture.
Right, exactly. The originating culture doesn't get its fair share of the recognition. Or worse, they see their traditions misrepresented.
Yeah, it's like taking something that's deeply meaningful to a community and turning it into a commodity without any regard for its history.
Exactly.
So that brings us to a really important question. Why does this matter? What's the impact of cultural appropriation?
Well, the script quotes a cultural anthropologist, Dr. Maya Ortiz.
Okay.
And she calls it a theft of identity.
Wow. Theft of identity. That's powerful.
It is, and it speaks to a deeper wound, I think. Imagine growing up in a culture that's been historically marginalized, where your traditions have been mocked or suppressed or even stolen.
Yeah.
And then you see those same traditions suddenly become trendy or fashionable, but in a way that feels disrespectful or even harmful to your community.
I can see how that would feel like a betrayal.
Exactly, like having a part of yourself taken away and exploited.
And it contributes to that sense of invisibility, I think.
Absolutely, especially for groups that are already struggling to be heard and recognized.
So it's not just about being politically correct or whatever. It's about real harm.
Exactly. It's about power dynamics and respect, and ultimately about justice, I think.
It's a lot to think about, for sure. But the script doesn't just dwell on the negative, thankfully. They also talk about what it looks like to engage with other cultures in a positive way.
Yeah, that's where cultural appreciation comes in.
Okay, so what does that look like? How do we make sure we're on the appreciation side of things?
Well, it starts with approaching another culture with genuine respect and a desire to learn, not just to borrow something because it seems cool or trendy.
Right, so it's about more than just the aesthetics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the script actually gives some good examples of what appreciation looks like in action.
Okay, like what?
Well, they talk about fashion designers who collaborate with artisans from another culture,
Okay.
and they make sure to share the profits fairly.
So it's a true partnership.
Yeah, it's not just about taking someone else's designs and slapping your name on them. It's about working together to create something new and beautiful.
And making sure everyone benefits.
Right.
Yeah.
And they also talk about music collaborations that blend genres while still respecting the roots of each style.
I love those kinds of projects where you have like a traditional folk singer teaming up with an electronic music producer.
Yeah, and somehow it just works.
It's amazing. And I think what's so cool about those collaborations is that they often lead to a deeper understanding and appreciation of both musical traditions.
It's not about one being better than the other or one overshadowing the other. It's about finding common ground and creating something richer than either could have achieved alone.
Right. It's like a true fusion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, the script talks about food too, which is something I'm always interested in.
Me too. It's such a big part of culture.
Absolutely.
Mm.
And they give the example of chefs who are passionate about sharing dishes from different cultures, but they do it in a way that honors their origins and educates their diners.
So it's not just about putting something trendy on the menu. It's about telling the story behind the food.
Right. And making sure that the people who created those dishes get the recognition they deserve.
And I love that they quote Amina Khan in the script. She's a chef and cultural advocate, and she talks about how much it means to her when someone tries a recipe from her culture and makes the effort to pronounce its name correctly.
Oh yeah, those little details can make a big difference.
It shows you're really trying to connect. You're not just treating it like some exotic novelty.
It's about recognizing that food is more than just sustenance. It's a story, it's a tradition, it's a way of life.
And when you approach it with that kind of respect, you're really building bridges between cultures.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got appropriation on one side and appreciation on the other. But in real life, how do we actually tell the difference?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Because sometimes the lines can feel blurry.
They can. And that's where the script comes in handy, because they give us this litmus test.
A litmus test. Okay, I like that.
With 4 key questions to ask ourselves.
To figure out whether we're in appropriation territory or appreciation territory.
Exactly. It's like a little checklist to help us be more mindful and make informed choices.
Okay, so what are the questions?
Well, the first one is all about context. Are we honoring the meaning behind a cultural element, or are we just using it superficially?
So, like, if I'm wearing a piece of clothing from another culture, do I understand its significance, or am I just trying to look cool?
That's a great example.
Yeah.
Because it's so easy to get caught up in the aesthetics without considering the deeper meaning.
Right. Like those headdresses we were talking about earlier, they're not just a fashion accessory. They have a deep spiritual meaning to Native American cultures.
Exactly. And if we don't understand that, we risk trivializing it or even using it in a way that's offensive.
So context is key.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The second question is about credit and compensation. Are the original creators being acknowledged and rewarded for their work?
Okay, so this goes back to that idea of exploitation we were talking about.
It does. It's about making sure that the people who created these cultural elements are fairly recognized and benefit from their use. Are they being paid for their expertise? Are they being given a platform to share their stories and perspectives?
So it's not just about avoiding harm, it's also about doing good.
Exactly. It's about being an ally and an advocate.
Okay, what's the third question?
The third one is intent versus impact. Even if our intentions are good, We need to consider how our actions might affect the originating culture.
So good intentions aren't enough.
They're not. We need to be aware that our actions can have unintended consequences, especially when we're interacting with cultures that have been historically marginalized or oppressed.
Right, because we might not even realize the harm we're causing.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to listen to the voices of those communities and be open to feedback, even if it's uncomfortable.
So humility is key.
I think so. Be willing to admit that we don't know everything and that we can always learn more.
Okay. And what's the final question?
The final question is about engagement. Are we genuinely interested in learning about the culture as a whole, or are we just cherry-picking the parts that appeal to us?
So it's not just about taking what we want and running.
It's about going deeper. It's about moving beyond appreciation as a trend and embracing it as a genuine commitment to understanding and respect.
So it's like the difference between being a tourist and being a traveler.
Exactly. A tourist just skims the surface. A traveler immerses themselves in the experience.
And a true appreciator of another culture is more like a traveler, I think.
I agree. They're willing to go beyond their comfort zone and really engage with the culture in all its complexity.
So these 4 questions give us a really solid framework for navigating this complex issue.
They do. It's like a roadmap to help us stay on the right path.
But where do we go from here? How do we actually put all of this into practice?
Yeah, it feels like we've talked about a lot, but I'm also wondering, what can we do with all of this?
Right, like how do we move forward?
How do we make sure we're on the right side of this whole thing? Well, the script quotes this cultural historian, Carlos Mendoza.
Okay.
And he says, we need more education about cultural histories and an openness to conversations about these issues.
That sounds simple enough, but I bet a lot of people don't even know where to begin.
Yeah, that's true. I think being proactive is key.
Yeah.
Like, we can't expect others to constantly educate us.
Right. We have to take responsibility for our own learning.
Exactly. We have to seek out information and perspectives from the cultures we're interested in.
So where do we even start? Like, what are some good resources?
Well, there are tons of amazing books and documentaries and articles out there.
Yeah, for sure.
And, of course, museums and cultural centers are great resources.
Yeah, I love going to museums.
They can be really eye-opening.
They are. And it makes me think about travel, too. You know, I've had some of my most meaningful cultural experiences while traveling.
Oh, absolutely. Travel can be such a powerful way to learn about other cultures.
It is, but it's definitely a learning curve to be a respectful visitor.
It is. There's a lot to be mindful of. But the beauty of travel is that it gives us the opportunity to learn directly from people who live and breathe these cultures.
Right, to hear their stories firsthand.
Exactly. And even before we step on a plane, we can do our research.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Learn some basic phrases in the local language. Familiarize ourselves with the customs and traditions.
It shows respect.
It does. And it makes the experience so much richer.
The script also talks about the importance of listening to the voices of the communities involved, but how do we actually do that?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's one easy answer, but I think it starts with being humble.
Okay.
Recognizing that we don't have all the answers and that we can always learn more.
So being open to being wrong.
Yeah, and being willing to listen without judgment. And when we hear perspectives that challenge our assumptions,
Yeah.
we need to be open to changing our minds.
That can be hard.
It can, but it's so important.
So it's not just about absorbing information. It's about engaging in a genuine dialogue.
Right.
Yeah.
And being open to learning from those with lived experiences.
Okay, I'm getting it. So this whole conversation has been super eye-opening for me. I mean, I knew cultural appropriation was a thing,
Right.
but it's a lot more nuanced than I initially thought.
I think that's true for a lot of people.
But now, armed with these 4 key questions from the script, I feel a lot more equipped to navigate it.
That's great. And that's the beauty of learning and having these conversations.
Yeah, totally.
It empowers us to be more conscious and intentional in our interactions with different cultures.
It's like we're not just stumbling around in the dark anymore.
Exactly. We have a flashlight now.
Haha, I like that. So to wrap up this deep dive, let's go back to where we started. You mentioned how you felt unsure about what cultural appropriation really meant. Do you feel any differently now?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like we've gone from a vague sense of something's not quite right to a much deeper understanding of why this matters, the harm it can cause, and what we can do to be part of the solution.
Same here. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that it's not about being perfect.
No, definitely not.
It's not about never making mistakes. It's about being willing to learn, to listen, and to constantly strive to be more respectful and appreciative of the cultures around us.
I couldn't have said it better myself. It's an ongoing journey. And the more we engage in these conversations, the more we'll all grow and learn together.
So as we end this deep dive, here's a final thought-provoking question for you to consider. How can you be an advocate for cultural appreciation in your own life? What are some concrete steps you can take to ensure that your engagement with other cultures is respectful, meaningful, and contributes to a more inclusive and understanding world?
Keep that question in mind.
Yeah.
The answers might surprise you. And they might even change the world around you.
So true. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.